Leading a startup team, whether you're delivering a sugar rush, stocking coffee, or getting a regular delivery of snacks, Office Depot has solutions that fit every startup culture, from getting those first business cards and stationery to ordering fleece pullovers with your new logo. To learn how Office Depot and the California Technology Council have partnered to bring you savings on all of these startup essentials and more, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Orphan drugs, therapeutics that target small patient populations, have become an enticing area for Big Pharma as companies are attracted to the premium prices, lower development cost, and faster path to market. A new EvaluatePharma report on the orphan drug market forecast a compounded annual sales growth rate of more than 11% through 2022, with orphan drugs accounting for more than 20% of total worldwide prescription sales by then. We spoke to Jon Gardner, U.S. editor for EP Vantage, about the growth of orphan drugs, what's driving the sector, and whether the way the industry is taking advantage of the Orphan Drug Act will cause policymakers to push back. Jon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about orphan drugs, what's driving their growth, and how large pharmaceutical companies have moved into these drugs for small indications in a big way. Let's begin with a definition, though. What constitutes an orphan drug?
An orphan drug is a drug for a rare disease that might not otherwise attract a lot of attention from pharmaceutical companies because of the small population. So the definition in the U.S. is for is a disease that affects fewer than 200,000 patients. In Europe and Japan, there are different definitions, but it's about those type of numbers. In the European Union, it's fewer than 5 in 10,000 patients, and in Japan, it's fewer than 50,000 patients.
Well, since the passage of the Orphan Drug Act in 1983, there have been incentives provided to drug makers to develop drugs for these small indications. What are the incentives this provides drug makers, and how has it changed the landscape for orphan drugs?
Chiefly, it's tax credit for the research and development that costs that companies put into developing the drug. So, in other words, what it does, it makes it less expensive for a pharmaceutical company to develop an orphan drug. On top of that, because these are smaller populations, the study populations, groups enrolled in the studies are by definition smaller, so it is therefore less expensive for clinical development to begin with. On top of that, there are incentives from an approval standpoint. Typically, the FDA is much more likely to accept surrogate endpoints that rely on some sort of logic curve instead of hard clinical outcomes, as is in the case of many primary care drugs, in order to get approval. So from that standpoint, it's a very attractive area for companies to get into because it costs less and it's less complex to get an actual regulatory approval.
Well, we had the first downtick in the number of orphan designations in 2016. Does that speak to any meaningful change, or does that reflect the rapid growth we've seen in recent years, which has been at possibly an unsustainable pace?
It's hard to say what that actually means, because broadly speaking, there were fewer approvals of drugs in 2016. So it may be just a statistical blip. Obviously, it's something we will want to watch closely. But I think that what happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that companies are so eager to fill pipelines that we saw a tremendous amount of clinical development. And I think that as companies were trying to fill pipelines, as trying to respond to patent expiration, that perhaps now we've just seen a sort of, if you will, a plateauing of activity, which could lead into a numerical downtick, but it may not be anything that is continued in 2017 and beyond. Obviously, we will want to keep a close eye on it because it would be another metric to measure R&D productivity of the industry. And I would be more concerned if in 2017, 2018, we saw a continued downturn in terms of numbers.
And overall, what kind of levels are we seeing in terms of orphan designations being granted?
I think it's around 300 or so.
So a robust number nonetheless.
It's a very large number, and obviously that won't yield 300 actual orphan drug approvals, and in many cases there will be multiple designations for a single drug as companies are trying to, in early stages, develop and identify the patient populations for which they're most effective. But still, it is it's a large number.
Orphan drugs have been embraced by the industry, as you noted, in part because of the faster path to development, smaller clinical trials, and lower costs to develop. Can you put some numbers to that? How do orphan drugs compare in terms of development cost and development time?
Off the top of my head, I think that you would probably have about half the cost at least, and probably half the development time, which means that they could from a pure financial standpoint be a much more profitable project. Obviously, each drug is a sample of one, and many cases they might take longer or cost more, but I think that you could obviously expect half or less than half in terms of time and money spent.
The other thing that's made these drugs particularly attractive to pharmaceutical companies is pricing. How do they generally compare in pricing between orphan drugs and non-orphan drugs?
Orphan drugs, in many cases, depending on the size of the population, you can expect per patient reimbursement to be in the hundreds of thousands range. A drug like Alexion Soliris is over is cost more than $400,000 a year, and that's for a very very recent population of the order of 2,000 patients in the U.S. As the populations get bigger, what you can expect in terms of reimbursement has shrunk or will shrink, particularly for, let's say, a cancer drug that has a specific orphan indication, but also has a broader patient population, like certain blood cancer drugs are examples of this. You would see more along the lines of the tens or maybe $100,000 in terms of reimbursement.
One of the most startling aspects of the growth of orphan drugs is the role they're expected to play in the overall revenue growth of the pharmaceutical industry. Can you put that into some perspective?
Well, I think it now is on the order of 20% of the worldwide prescription sales, or will be by 2022. So there's no doubt that companies look to this as a potential growth drivers, and some companies have gone, have become pure play, or at least semi-pure play, if you will, orphan drug companies like Shire, has gone very heavily into orphan drugs in recent years, and they've seen they continue to see their a significant revenue growth that outpaces many of the larger peers in the pharmaceutical industry.
I take it in the next 5 years, they're expected to contribute about half of overall revenue growth for the industry.
That's correct.
One of the things we've seen as part of the move towards targeted therapies and precision medicine is a narrowing of patient populations in terms of indications, primarily for cancer drugs. One of the things that I find striking about the list of top-selling orphan drugs is how it is dominated by cancer therapies. What does the group of top-selling orphan drugs look like?
Well, so in at least for 2016, the top-selling orphan drug was Revlimid, which is a hematology oncology drug that is a blood cancer drug. And looking to the future, the top-selling orphan drug, defined as orphan drug, would be I believe cancer drugs also. The important thing to consider there is that much of their revenue will not be in the orphan indication, but it's a significant way for them to perhaps get to market first in a single indication that then allows them to expand outward into other indications. On the other hand, there are drugs you would consider, for example, pure play orphan drugs. For example, as we mentioned, Soliris, which is only approved in a single or two very small indications, and that is going that is worth considering when you view the orphan sector.
Well, in that regard, are we seeing the orphan designation being awarded to the types of drugs it was intended to incentivize the development of, or have the barriers orphan drug definition been stretched into something else?
It has. I think it's fair to say that it's been stretched into something else, and you could have a strong debate about whether or not the FDA should and the European Medicines Agency should perhaps tighten their views on what orphan drugs are. But on the other hand, you don't want to disincentivize companies from developing a broad drug for the broadly applicable drug for a specific orphan indication, if in fact this underserved patient population can see some benefit.
Well, one thing drug makers would love to do is to win approval for a drug with an orphan designation and then expand that indication and grow the potential market. How common is it that companies are able to do this?
I think it's not it doesn't happen very frequently, but it does happen. And I think that but you'll see a lot of times, in many cases, it'll be a small biotech that has ambitions of becoming a larger company and want to achieve that first approval and establish a revenue stream that they can then use to finance continued development of that drug into broader disease categories.
So when we think about the dominant players in orphan drugs, are they the companies you traditionally think of as rare disease companies, or are they the large pharmaceutical companies?
Well, I think it depends on how you view the orphan sphere. We define it, of course, as drugs that have achieved an orphan designation. So a company like Celgene, for example, which is largely an oncology company, is the big seller, or has the biggest sales in the orphan sphere. On the other hand, you also see there are companies like, for example, Sanofi, which went into this in a big way when it bought out Genzyme a few years ago, has become a significant player. But there are also companies like, as I mentioned, for example, Shire, which has which has, I think, in many ways swung away from what you would call the primary care drugs and into their rare disease field, and have managed to establish themselves as a big player in this in orphan disease as almost a pure play company.
There's been talk about allowing the repatriation of profits from overseas for pharmaceutical companies, and the expectation that this could really drive M&A activity in the industry. Would you expect the orphan drug companies to be likely targets?
I think that it's fair to say yes. A company like Alexion, for example, has been talked about for years as a takeout candidate. It's really an issue of even in our sort of post biotech boom era, the valuation and whether or not companies can justify the price they may end up paying for a company like Alexion. Shire is another example. It's been a target in the past. It could be a target in the future. Obviously, it's a UK, Irish domiciled company, so that's not the same situation. But I think you would see them obviously rising in prominence if repatriation does indeed happen.
We talked about the stretching of the use of the Orphan Drug Act. Is there concerns about any kind of pushback, either from payers or from policymakers? Is there a risk that they'll come under greater scrutiny and lead to payers and lawmakers, putting new restrictions or pricing pressures on these drugs?
Well, we've already started to see that a bit. If you have followed the affairs of Sarepta and their new drug Exondys 51, which is a rare disease drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, they had significant pushback from payers, including some insurers who wouldn't pay for it at all because it still constitutes an experimental drug, and were not persuaded by the clinical data that Sarepta has offered so far. A second drug that's been approved recently is Spinraza, Biogen's drug for spinal muscular atrophy. Some of the payers have come out and said we will only reimburse this exactly for as it is labeled by the FDA. We won't, which defines a rather specific group of spinal muscular atrophy patients. So therefore, people are very concerned about the prices that are being charged by these companies. But I think, in some regards, I think there is probably reluctance from the FDA to take action because of what could be the political implications of that. And I don't think that the current Congress is interested in any way in tightening drug approvals or proving to be a barrier to drug approvals.
Jon Gardner, U.S. Editor for EP Vantage. Jon, thanks as always.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.